was the Gulag? What was its purpose? How did it end? Let's find out in today's episode of the History Chronicles. Today's History Chronicle begins on the 25th of January 1960. On that day, the Gulag, a government agency which had been operating in Soviet Russia for approximately 40 years, was shut down on the orders of the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Since it was set up in the early 1920s, the Gulag had overseen the running of hundreds of forced labor and prison camps across Russia. In total, these camps had detained approximately 18 million people over the years. While there is no clear answer to how many people died in the camps, modern estimates suggest at least 1.5 million people died under the Gulag system. This is the story of the Gulag and the system of oppression which underpinned it in Stalinist Russia. The Gulag and the camp system, which were so ubiquitous in Russia during the 30 years of Stalin's reign there, were not entirely novel. Under the imperial rule of the Tsars in the 19th and early 20th century, a penal labor system known as katorga was practiced against some criminals, but the numbers involved rarely exceeded 10,000 in all of Russia at a given time. Others were exiled to distant and cold Siberia, and this included communists such as Stalin and Leon Trotsky before the revolution of 1917. Following that revolution and during the Russian Civil War, Lenin's government established a prison camp system under the management of the first major Soviet secret police service, the Cheka. This embryonic camp system gradually developed during the course of the Russian Civil War, as the number of political prisoners being held by the Soviets increased. In 1923, it was bizarrely proposed by an inmate of one of these camps, Naftali Frankel, that they should be turned into labor camps so that additional efficiencies could be created, such as the linking of food rations to the productivity of the inmates. His proposals were passed on to senior Soviet officials, and Frankel went from being a prisoner to being a commander of one of the first camps administered by the Gulag. Shortly afterwards, an agency was set up to administer a new network of labor camps across Russia. The name Gulag was an acronym for the new body which was set up in 1923, effectively meaning the chief administration of the camps. The system of camps which the Gulag was overseeing increased steadily in size following the rise to power of Joseph Stalin as Lenin's successor, following the first Soviet leader's death in 1924. Yet, as large as it was in the 1920s, the system ballooned from 1929 onwards as the government began purging the peasant class called the kulaks from Russian society. These were now classed as a vestigial capitalist element within the Soviet Union, and millions of kulaks were either forced into exile or ended up in the Gulag-run camps. As a result of all this, in the end, there were some 476 different Gulag-run camps across Russia, with about 2,000 smaller offshoots, though not all of these were operational at the same time. The camps administered by the Gulag were located in some of the remotest parts of Russia. Originally, some were established on the sites of old Orthodox church monasteries, which had been taken under state ownership. But soon, new camps were established in high numbers in very unpleasant environments. Several near the White Sea in the north, some along the arid border region with Kazakhstan, and many out eastwards in the region north of Mongolia. There was also a high concentration of camps near Vladivostok in the eastern extremities of Russia. Many of the camps were in proximity to the Trans-Siberian Railway, which connected Moscow to Vladivostok, but was still remote from any major settlements, so that escape was virtually impossible. There is some uncertainty as to how many people eventually ended up in the Gulag system at different times. For instance, in the 1920s, the number was relatively low, while from the early 1930s it began building steadily. By 1935, there were approximately 1.1 million people interred in camps and labor colonies run by the Gulag across Russia, and this would increase again during the Second World War. In total, at least 18 million Russians were interred in the camps between 1923 and 1960. Indeed, so ubiquitous were the camps and those who had spent time in them that the word Gulag in Western perceptions has become synonymous with the camps themselves and those who were interred in them. Unsurprisingly, conditions within the camps were not good. As we have seen, many of them were located in some of the most inhospitable parts of Russia, by the White Sea in northern Russia and throughout Siberia. In these parts of Russia, winter temperatures can average between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius. On top of this, prisoners had their food rations tied to their productivity. Those who could not work perished quickly. Add to this poor clothing to protect against the cold, appalling sanitation, overcrowding within the camps, and almost non-existent healthcare, and life in the Gulag camps was very harsh indeed. As we will see, it became even harsher still during certain periods, such as the years of the Second World War. The role of the Gulag system in the economy of the Soviet Union was profound. The intention of the system was to provide labour for the state, rather than being genocidal in the manner which the camp system operated by Nazi Germany became. Accordingly, all prisoners were forced to work, and their rations were generally tied to their productivity to incentivize hard work. Moreover, the idea was that by locating the labour camps in some of the remotest parts of Russia, the natural resources of these regions could be exploited and settlements constructed in ways which civil society would not do of its own volition. As a result of all this, the Gulag system became one of the cornerstones of the mining industry in the Soviet Union. Forced labour mined nearly half of the country's nickel, cobalt and chrome iron ore, as well as 60% of the gold mined in Russia and an enormous 76% of all tin. They were also responsible for felling an enormous amount of trees throughout the wayward and wild East, at as much as 25% of all timber being produced in Russia between the 1920s and 1950s was cut down and sawn by inmates of the Gulag-run camps. From the early 1940s onwards, there was a major shift to reorientating the camps to produce war material following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Two periods were especially brutal for the inmates of the Gulag system. The first occurred in 1932 and 1933, when a famine ravaged the Soviet Union, largely created by the rampant persecution of the Kulak class by Stalin's government since 1929. Eventually it would kill between 5 and 8 million people across Russia and other areas, such as the Ukraine. As food shortages rose amongst the civilian population, the rations allocated to the inmates of the labour camps were reduced to as little as 300 calories per day. By the first half of 1933, as much as 15% of the population of the camps was dying every month owing to starvation and mass shootings of prisoners who tried to escape as a result of the brutal conditions. As bad as the conditions of 1932 and 1933 were, they were eclipsed by what occurred in the first half of the 1940s. Initially, Stalin's regime came to an agreement with Hitler's Germany, whereby they divided up Poland and the surrounding countries between them. This led to a huge increase in the population of the Gulag-run camps, as hundreds of thousands of political prisoners from Poland and the Baltic region were detained. Then, following the German invasion of Russia in the summer of 1941, productivity quotas were increased, as Stalin's regime desperately tried to put itself on a total war footing against the advancing tide of the German Wehrmacht. Simultaneously, rations to the inmates were reduced. The result of all this was an escalating level of mortality within the camps from late 1941 onwards. By the time the war commenced, there was approximately 1.5 million inmates within the Gulag system. 115,000 of these alone died in 1941, then over 350,000 perished in 1942, followed by 260,000 in 1943. The rate declined considerably thereafter, as the Russians pushed the Germans back into Poland, and then Germany itself. In total, nearly 1 million people lost their lives in the Gulag camps during the course of the Second World War. In 1942 alone, roughly 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the system died. What is somewhat anomalous about the Gulag and the camps that it administered is that historians have found virtually zero evidence to suggest that there was an orchestrated plan to work inmates to death or systematically kill them, such as had occurred in the concentration camp system operated by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Instead, it seems to have been the case that the camps and the conditions in them were designed to be brutal in such a way that there was a very high mortality rate in general, one which accounts for the deaths of a minimum of about 1.5 million people, although some historians argue that the number of deaths was probably considerably higher. The end of the war actually led to a further large expansion of the camp system, driven primarily by hundreds of thousands of political prisoners who were arrested across Eastern Europe as the Soviets extended their empire all the way to Germany. A huge proportion of these were former soldiers of the Red Army, who had been taken prisoner by the Germans during the course of the war. These former POWs returned to Russia, where they were treated as traitors for having been taken alive. Well in excess of 1 million of these men were liberated from the German camps only to be sent to the Gulag camps in their own homeland after the war, though many only served short sentences. By 1950, the Gulag system had well in excess of 2 million inmates housed in hundreds of camps across Russia. But it would soon come to an end of sorts. When Stalin died in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev was determined to rule the Soviet Union in a less brutal fashion. In the mid-1950s, he began condemning his predecessor's actions, and the period is typically referred to as the Khrushchev Thaw, as the totalitarianism of the Stalinist period was not dispensed with entirely, but toned down very considerably. As part of this, the Gulag was shut down as a government body in 1960. Though labour camps continued to exist throughout the Soviet Union, the scale of these declined considerably from the 1960s onwards. The Gulag system has cast a long shadow over modern Russia, not least because of the sheer number of people who passed through the camps over a near 40-year period. Many of those same individuals later went on to write about their experiences. The most acclaimed is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was imprisoned in a Gulag camp for 8 years between the latter stages of the Second World War and the early 1950s. In 1973, he published the most celebrated work on the Gulag system and its impact on Russian society, the Gulag Archipelago, though it was prohibited in the Soviet Union at the time, and Solzhenitsyn was forced to flee from Russia. Today, it is required reading in Russian schools. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the Gulag. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.